Before the championships, before the standard, there were two numbers, 27 and 1. Nick Chubb just retired from football. And when I saw the news, I didn't just think about Nick Chubb. I thought about Sony Michel. Because for a generation of Georgia fans, you almost can't remember one without remembering the other. Number 27, number 1, Nick and Sony. And now, for the first time since we watched those two young men arrive in Athens, they're both finished playing football. Sony walked away a few years ago, and now Nick has followed him. And maybe it's because I'm getting, a little older too, but something about that hits different. Because when you really stop and think about it, those two weren't just two great Georgia running backs. They were there when everything started changing. They were there before the national championships, before Georgia became the monster it is today, before the expectation every single year became win it all. And no, Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, they never got to lift that national championship trophy together at Georgia. And as Dog fans, I think that's something that will always hurt a little bit for us because they came back. They gave Georgia one more year. They took us right to the doorstep, and they never got the ending that we all wanted for them. But maybe, just maybe, their story was never supposed to be about finishing it. Maybe their story was about starting it. This is the Hunker Down Podcast. Let's go back to 2014. Georgia already knew it had Sony Michel, an explosive 5-star running back coming out of Florida. And then there was this quiet kid from Cedartown, Georgia, Nick Chubb. Nobody could have known what those two names would eventually mean around here. Chubb, man, he exploded onto the scene as a freshman. Todd Gurley goes down, and suddenly the freshman is carrying the load. And by the end of that first season, Nick Chubb had rushed for more than 1,500 yards. But what made this backfield special wasn't that Georgia had one great running back. Georgia had two. They were different. Chubb was power, balance, violence, that ridiculous ability to get hit, keep his feet, and somehow come out on the other side. Sony was different. He was smooth, explosive, one cut, and he was gone. Nick would run through you. Sony might make you reach for air, and for 4 years, Georgia could hand the football to either one of them. Now, there may have been more decorated individual running backs to wear the G. We all know there's only one Herschel Walker. We've watched Knowshon Marino, Todd Gurley, Garrison Hurst, Terrell Davis. Man, the list at Georgia is ridiculous. But when somebody asks me, what is the greatest running back duo Georgia ever had? There's no thinking about it. Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. And then Knoxville. Nick Chubb's knee buckled near the sideline against Tennessee. And if you watched it live, you remember that feeling because this wasn't just some ordinary injury. This looked bad. Man, it looked really bad. And suddenly the question wasn't whether Nick Chubb would become one of Georgia's all-time greats. The question was whether we would ever see the same Nick Chubb again. Now, while Nick began that long road back, Sony helped carry Georgia's backfield. And that's the important part of their story. When one went down, the other one was there. And then came 2016, Kirby Smart's very first game as Georgia's head coach. North Carolina, Georgia Dome. And after surgery, after rehab, after months of people wondering what Nick Chubb would look like, Georgia handed him the football and handed it to him again and again and again. 32 carries, 222 yards, 2 touchdowns. Nick Chubb didn't need to tell anybody he was back. He never said much anyways. He just took the football 32 times and answered everybody. That's Nick Chubb. Football knocks him down, Nick gets back up. But Georgia wasn't Georgia yet. Kirby's first season ended with 8 wins. There were some ugly losses. We lost to Vanderbilt, Florida, Georgia Tech, and Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, they had a decision to make. The NFL was waiting. They had already given Georgia 3 years. Nick had already suffered the kind of knee injury that reminds every running back that this game doesn't last forever. And by Nick's own account, at that time, he had pretty much made up his mind that he was leaving. But something didn't feel right. He talked with Sony, and then came the announcement. Nick Chubb was coming back. Sony Michel was coming back. Lorenzo Carter was coming back. David Bellamy was coming back. They weren't finished. Think about that decision now, because it's easy to look backward, knowing what happened next. But these guys didn't know. They couldn't see the future. They didn't know Georgia would play for a national championship the very next year. They didn't know what Kirby Smart's program would eventually become. They were betting on it. They believed, Nick said they wanted to help build Georgia into what it should be, and Sony would later say something that, man, looking back today gives me chills. He said they had an opportunity to set the tone for Georgia football. Man, Sony, you had no idea, because that's exactly what you did. Now, if you're a Georgia fan, you remember that season. Notre Dame, that Sea of Red taking over South Bend, the revenge game against Auburn, the SEC championship. Georgia hadn't won the conference since 2005. 12 years, and in Kirby Smart's second season, the seniors who decided to come back helped put Georgia on the top of the SEC. But they weren't finished, because next came Pasadena, the Rose Bowl. Man, what a game. And if somebody younger ever asks you why Georgia fans talk about Nick Chubb and Sony Michel the way we do, show them that football game. Oklahoma had Georgia down, 31-17 at halftime. Baker Mayfield and Oklahoma looked like they were about to run Georgia right out of California. Then those dogs started running. Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, again and again and again. Nick finished with 145 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Sony had 181 rushing yards and 4 total touchdowns, more than 300 rushing yards between the two of them. And then came overtime. Lorenzo Carter, he blocks that Oklahoma field goal attempt, and Georgia gets the football. Sony Michel, he takes the snap, and 27 yards later, touchdown, ball game. Georgia was going to play for the national championship, and of course, it was Sony Michel, one of the seniors, who came back running Georgia all the way to Atlanta. January 8th, 2018, Atlanta, Georgia, Alabama. Now, you already know where this part of the story goes. Georgia led 13-0, then 20-7, and for a while, it felt like those seniors were about to get the ending they came back for. A national championship at Georgia together. Then Alabama came back. Overtime, Rodrigo Blankenship, he pushed Georgia ahead, and then 2nd and 26. Touchdown, Alabama, 26-23, and just like that, it was over. Nick Chubb's final game at Georgia, Sony Michel's final game at Georgia, the closest Georgia had been to a national championship since 1980, and they had to watch it disappear in one play. Now, I've thought a lot about that team over the years. And I know what somebody watching this might say, Matt, they didn't win it. And you know what? You're right. They didn't win it. And I will never take 1 ounce of credit away from the players who eventually did. Jordan Davis, man, he earned his championship. N'Kobe Dean earned his. Stetson Bennett earned his. Brock Bowers, Trayvon Walker, Lewis Singh, Keely Ringo, Kirby Smart. Every player and coach on those 21 and 22 teams earned those trophies. But you know what? Championship programs don't appear out of thin air. Somebody has to believe first. Somebody has to say. Somebody has to establish what's acceptable. Somebody has to show the next group, this is how close we can get. And that's why the 2017 team matters so much. That's why Chubb and Michel matter so much. Now, they didn't inherit the Georgia standard we know today. They helped create it. After Athens, their lives went in different directions. Sony Michel went to the NFL and finally got the championship rings that had escaped him at Georgia. Not 1, but 2 Super Bowl rings. One with New England, another with Los Angeles. And in 2023, at only 28 years old, Sony decided his football journey was over. His body was telling him it was time. Now, Nick's NFL journey became something completely different. He became one of the best running backs in professional football. 4 Pro Bowls, 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, more than 7,000 career rushing yards, and for years, when Cleveland needed yards, everybody in that stadium knew who was getting the football. And somehow, they still couldn't stop number 24. But then football asked Nick Chubb that same question again. Can you get back up? Another devastating knee injury, the same knee, another surgery, another rehab, another roadblock, and somehow Nick Chubb got back on the NFL field again. Because you know what? That's what Nick Chubb did. In his retirement announcement, Nick talked about those injuries. He talked about getting back up, getting back to work, getting back onto the field. And then he said something that tells you why he's ready now. Health is the real wealth. At 30 years old, Nick Chubb has decided there's more life waiting for him beyond football. Meanwhile, back in Athens, the program kept going. Close, close, close. And then Georgia and Alabama again. Except this time, the ending changed. Indianapolis, 4th quarter, Keely Ringo picks off Bryce Young. Georgia Bulldogs, national champions. 41 years of waiting, over. And then Georgia turned around the very next season and did it all again. Back-to-back national champions, and somewhere in all that celebration, man, I thought about those guys from 2017. Because before Georgia knew what it felt like to win the whole thing, that team showed Georgia what it felt like to belong there. Before championships became the expectation, Nick Chubb and Sony Michel helped make competing for one real again. They weren't the entire foundation. There were a whole lot of damn good dogs laying those bricks. Roquan Smith, Lorenzo Carter, David Bellamy, Dominique Sanders, and plenty more. That's the part that's hard for me to wrap my head around because, guys, in my memory, they're still young. They're still standing in that Georgia backfield. Nick, he's waiting on the handoff. Sony's bouncing on his toes. They're still running between the hedges. They're still in Pasadena. They're still celebrating together. And maybe that's how we'll always remember them. 27-1, Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, thunder and lightning. Two young men who decided Georgia was worth coming back for. Two running backs who combined for more than 8,400 rushing yards wearing that G. Two friends who gave Georgia everything they had. And two damn good dogs who came within inches of the ending every Georgia fan wanted for them. Nick Chubb and Sony Michel never won the national championship. They came back to Georgia chasing. And if you love this program, I think there'll always be a little part of you that wishes they had. Because they deserved that moment. They deserved the confetti. They deserved to stand on that stage together. They deserved to hold that trophy. But maybe their Georgia story wasn't supposed to end with them holding it. Maybe their job was to make the guys who came behind them believe them that one day Georgia could. They didn't get to finish it, but never, ever forget they helped start it. Thank you, Sony. Thank you, Nick, for every yard, every touchdown, every Saturday, every memory, and for helping change what it meant to play football at the University of Georgia. And Dog Nation, I want to hear from you on this one. If you were there for the Chubb and Michel era, tell me the moment you'll remember forever. Was it Nick's comeback against North Carolina? Was it Sony breaking loose in Pasadena? Was it the SEC championship? Or is there another play that immediately takes you back? Put it in the comments because those memories, that's how guys like Nick Chubb and Sony Michel live forever in this program. And if you're one of the people who believe those two helped lay the foundation for everything Georgia became afterward, just leave me two numbers. 27-1. But with that, guys, I'm out of here. And tonight, maybe a little more than usual. You know what it is, baby. Go Dogs.